6:32, and you're listening to the 123 show with me, Noreen Mayer, on this Thursday afternoon. Now, let's turn to our first guest and topic of today. We're talking about clutter and also hoarding, and what are some of the effects of that on our mental health. And to mull over this, we're joined by Dr. Eslin Terragina, a chartered psychologist and psychotherapist with Mind Balance. Dr. Terragina, welcome to the program, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me, Noreen, and it's great to be back.
Yes, it's lovely to speak to you. So let's talk a little bit more about the psychology. You know, why do people hoard things? And I don't know, I'm sort of guilty of it. I'm a bit of a hoarder. So why do people do it?
Well, a lot of hoarding is an emotional attachment, right? So we attach certain feelings to certain objects, and a lot of it can be anxiety related as well. So we collect all sorts of tools and little bits and pieces that we may need at some point in the future, just in case. And same with things like dishware and things like that. But also just like our favorite jeans from 10 years ago that we're not quite ready to let go. Is that what you're guilty of?
Yeah, in case I'll fit in it again.
Yeah, exactly. It's very, very common to do that. So, it's things that remind us of happier times. It sometimes resembles someone we'd like to be. So, maybe we collect some art material, or we go buy some art material and store it for a while in the hope that at some point we'll sit down and do that painting. So lots of different reasons.
And when does having too much stuff become hoarding? I mean, there's a difference between just saving it just in case, and then is that really hoarding? I mean, when does too much stuff become hoarding?
Sure. So when do we move from clutter to hoarding?
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Hoarding is a diagnosable disorder, right? So that's when we have such persistent difficulty to let go of items and possessions, regardless of what their value is. Obviously, it has an emotional value to the person who's hoarding, but it really compromises their living space. It compromises their social life. It's linked to isolation and loneliness. People might withdraw. They might be embarrassed of having visitors in their house, and not the usual embarrassment of, oh, my house is a little untidy, but actually, there's no space to move, or persistent negative feelings around the hoarding items.
Yeah. And is it associated with sort of other disorders as well? I mean, like OCD or maybe even depression?
Sure. I mean, yeah, there's definitely studies have shown there's links to depression. Actually, more so to depression than OCD. A lot of elevated stress hormones. In part that's because, ironically, even though some of the stuff that we may clutter our house with somehow makes us feel safe, or it makes us anxious to separate from these items, at the same time they also represent an invasion of what should really be our secure, our safe space at home. So that people might start feeling overwhelmed because we don't know where to start with the declutter. Also maybe guilty because there's been that stack of papers that I've been meaning to go through for months and maybe even years, and it's still sitting there. So it's almost like a constant reminder of unfinished business. And then feeling a little bit trapped and maybe even claustrophobic. I think it's important to point out as well that brains they juggle to process all the stimuli in our environment. So if there's a lot of clutter, it can make them overstimulated. Now, in theory, brains are meant to adapt to that because, if there's no novel stimulus in the environment, the brain should not continuously process something new. But because a lot of our clutter objects have a big emotional importance to us, the brain may continuously kind of make us aware, oh, that's still there, oh, that's still there. So it doesn't, it tires us out as well.
So because of all the visual stimuli, because it's so busy in the room that it actually affects us in different ways, maybe even our concentration, or even making us more stress, or poor decision making. It could lead to a whole series of things. Absolutely,
yeah. And just to come back to your OCD question as well, I mean, the heart of OCD is anxiety, and the anxiety is alleviated by compulsive behaviors, right? So kind of repetitive rituals, for example. So hoarding can be part of that if that's where your OCD or your compulsive behaviors kind of click onto. But OCD also has the opposite, so you could be a compulsive declutterer. So if the items are causing you anxiety, you might actually start decluttering more. So the link to that isn't as direct as to, say, for example, depression.
Is it linked to creativity by any chance? Because I don't know, as cliche as it sounds, but creative people often have quite messy desks. I don't know. Maybe there's something to do with it. The visual, I don't know, mess makes them more creative.
I'm not sure if there's studies that really support that. However, I mean, you are onto something. The difference with good clutter in a way that might be more stimulating.
Oh, yeah, organized clutter.
Organized clutter is that it might be a system by which someone has tried to help jog their memory, or a system by which people have put things in, have had that mess because they know it stimulates creativity. So it's an organized one. The key thing here is how fast can someone actually find what they're looking for? Because if you say, oh, can you go pick this up, and they go straight to it, and in very little time have located it, then it's more of an organized mess. But if it takes hours, or we're almost overwhelmed and we don't even want to start looking for it, that's when it starts becoming clutter, and could also go further to becoming too much clutter.
Yeah, well, like you said about the decluttering, I think it's been quite trendy to do so. I think very famously Marie Kondo, she has a Netflix series, and the Marie Kondo way of decluttering. I mean, what are some of the ways to start decluttering then?
Starting with the awareness of what emotions are attached to our items. So using your jeans as an example, what's the emotion attached to that? What meaning does that jeans have for you? And then
I was a lot thinner back then. A carefree life.
Well, see, and so if you've got happy feelings around that jeans, then maybe it's something to keep, right? But if there's some guilt or some frustration or some anxiety or something around that, and also the likelihood, are you going to use it again? How important is the item to you?
Probably not. Start. Yeah, so it'll have to go to the re-gift pile or something like that.
Oh yes, recycling. I like it. Another thing to do is pick a category to start with, right? So either maybe I'll sort through my clothes, or I'll sort through my books, or I'll sort through my with dishware, or clearing one room at a time. Because if you've accumulated a lot of clutter and a lot of it is emotional, it will take a while. It's not something that you can just do in an hour and then the whole house is cleared, right? So scheduling time for it.
And it can, like you said, it can be quite emotional. I mean, what if you live with somebody or family member or a friend has an issue with hoarding or with clutter in their home? How do you sort of go about helping them through this? Because like you said, it can be quite an emotional experience. They can have an emotional attachment to something. How do you get them to separate from things that they don't necessarily need and to clear the space?
Sure. So I'll address cluttering, because hoarding, because it can be a clinical disorder, that will take a bit more in-depth analysis. But in terms of clutter, I mean, again, being aware of the emotional connection. So, it's just because something doesn't mean anything to us. Obviously, for whoever we're living with who is cluttering, or friends, there is a big emotional meaning there. So really addressing that and validating that and being understanding of that. One of the ways that I know people have found helpful is digitalizing things. So if you've got books that really meant something to you, taking a photo and then letting them go. And also items, if you can't keep something but it's been really meaningful, in a way, keeping it in a digital way, that can help reduce the clutter in the actual house.
Yeah. That's a really
decluttering.
Good idea. Taking a photo of the jeans, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And you could even do a vision board or something. There's lots of ways of playing around and having fun. Organizing things and labeling them can be useful, because then we might find we have 3 hammers and we don't need 3 hammers.
Yes.
But decluttering can be really rewarding, because if we take the time for the process, it can help us to remember who we used to be, but also see how we've grown as people and how far we've come as people. And then even more so, working into the future, it can create more space to give us room for creativity and room for growth,
Exactly. What about, you mentioned just now, hoarding is actually a sign of, it can be a sign of a mental disorder. So there's a key difference between clutter and a clutterer and a hoarder, really.
Yes, absolutely. So hoarding is defined in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual as a hoarding disorder. But that's very much when collecting items and the persistent difficulty of parting with these items really interferes with your living space. It congests active living areas. It basically almost takes control of how you're living and how your social life is, and maybe even interfering with your work life and family life and other important areas of functioning.
Wow. So it can have really adverse effects on our health, not just mental health, but even physical health and relationships as well.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Wow. Okay. Not quite there yet, but it's so easy to collect clutter, especially in such small apartment spaces such as Hong Kong. And you're absolutely right. It's a really good chance to really start decluttering in specific areas. Maybe start in the kitchen and then start with your bookshelf. And as Marie Kondo once said, I think she said, you only ever need 30 books in rotation. I don't know.
Right.
I think I may have a bit more than that in the house.
Well, that's where, for the people who enjoy it, Kindle comes in, right? Or some other kind of form of tablet, or, again, digitalizing. It doesn't necessarily solve the issue of what's at the heart of the cluttering, because obviously, in a way, you're just transferring it to a different platform. But by putting it onto a digital platform, it will definitely reduce how much it affects you, because you're not constantly looking at all those books and they're not interfering with your living space, right? They've been compartmentalized in a way.
That's really good advice. Okay, I think I'll start doing that. And I'm sure most of our listeners, if they have a lot of clutter in their house, they can start to digitalize them instead and clear some space. Meanwhile, if you want to also connect with Dr. Terragina and want to find out more, you can also go to her website on mindbalance.org. Meanwhile, thank you very much indeed for your time this week, Dr. Eslyn Terragina, a chartered psychologist and psychotherapist with Mind Balance, joining us this afternoon. Thank you very much, Eslyn.
Pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, yeah.